Brady Green, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for lining it up. And before we go any further and get into the depths of the discussion, I'm super excited to have you over in the UK for the Rehab conference on the 12th and 13th of October at the Etihad in Manchester. So yeah, you amongst a great lineup of people, but yeah, super happy to have you and thank you for saying yes. And I'm glad it lined up.
Oh, my pleasure. Look, it looks to be an outstanding conference. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other presenters, meeting the people attending, and yeah, it looks to be a great couple of days.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. So yeah, let's dive in. So anyone that doesn't know who you are, Brady, would you mind just giving us a bit of background to you, what you're currently doing, what you've done in the past, and then we'll get into what people know you for, which is calves.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I'm obviously Brady. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Notre Dame and also have an adjunct role at La Trobe University. Prior to my academic position, I worked in elite sport at the Essendon Football Club as a physiotherapist for a time, and I had a range of roles in elite sport, focusing on clinical management, injury prevention, as well as performance rehabilitation. I've worked in private practice settings, focusing primarily on musculoskeletal and sports physiotherapy. Um, and yeah, that's sort of me. In terms of my research, I'm mostly interested in calf muscle strain injuries and prevention of calf muscle strains, as well as some additional projects focusing on quadriceps and hamstring and so forth.
So why calves? It's fascinating how people like gravitate towards one thing; it just becomes their thing. So why calves for you?
Yeah, look, I think historically, hamstrings have been the number one problem in sport, hamstring muscle strain injuries. And so logically, the bulk of the research has been devoted to the hamstring. And certainly many research groups have made some really good headway in understanding hamstring function, hamstring injury, rehab and prevention. But over time, it's become really apparent that there is this knowledge and practice gap in the calf, and calf injuries still remain very prevalent, often second to hamstring injuries. And one of the problems with calves as well is this propensity for recurrent injuries that seems to be entrenched in a number of sports. And as we know, and as we find clinically, unfortunately, when people sustain a recurrence, it can really set them back and they can be out for a much longer time than they would say just after a first time injury. And we certainly found that with our evaluation of the data from the elite Australian Football League. um, and so yeah, there's this significant gap in terms of calf injuries, and that's really led us to all the projects that you're about to hear about.
So have you got any data on the top of your head, off the top of your head, of where calves sit in the kind of hierarchy of injury issues amongst different sports?
Yeah, so like historically, across your major footballing codes, as mentioned, you'll see the major soft tissue injury commonly being hamstring muscle strains. But then in certain seasons, coming in second is often the calf. Um, Something that was really interesting that was published from Shane Kelly's group and some examination of retrospective data from track and field was that when they accounted for things like time loss associated with injury, in track and field, soleus injuries actually represented one of the highest. I think it was in the top 5 injury burden in track and field, highlighting not just in our sort of team field-based sports, but also potentially in individual sports and running related sports. Calf injuries are a big problem too.
Are they on the rise?
Um,
Are
I,
they
th-
steady?
I think we can say that they've got consistent prevalence and consistent rates of recurrence. Um, that, despite our efforts at times, that number isn't necessarily coming down. I think in some codes around the world, they're feeling that, yeah, they're attempting to reduce the incidence, but they're not making a heap of headway. And the other thing that they're finding is that often when a calf injury does occur, the burden can be quite significant. So where you may be able to get away with certain low-grade hamstring or quadriceps or adductor muscle strain injuries and potentially players don't miss, sometimes calf injuries aren't as forgiving, and there's no escaping sort of the impact that they have on function. And so the consequence of calf injuries can sometimes be a bit of a hidden part of the injury burden, and highlight sort of the true problem that they represent.
So what is it about the calf that makes it an issue for reoccurrence? And we'll go on to like prognosis and things like that around recurrence and initial injury. But what is it about the calf that makes it an issue for reoccurrence?
Yeah, so factors that predispose to recurrence in the calf versus other injury locations. Yeah. Yeah, look, I think, it's well established that the work demands for the calf are very high. Even if we're running at very elementary or slow running speeds, the calf muscles, and particularly soleus, is still producing and moderating really high forces, multiple body weight loads. And so, in situations that they might be low load for other injuries, they're still high load for the calf. And then that high load situation obviously continues through the whole spectrum of any activity that an athlete or a person will perform, from the really easy, slow paced stuff all the way through to the more dynamic, high end type activities, e.g., your sprinting and your high speed running. So, from a work demand perspective, the calf is probably less forgiving, and there's no escaping that work that the calf and particularly soleus needs to do. And I think that's a big reason that um, calf injuries are prone to recurrence as well. In that, if we are exposing the calf to activities that it doesn't have the capacity to withstand too soon, then we might get a recurrence during what would otherwise be quite an innocuous activity for, say, another muscle strain. An example would be, say, reintroduction to running, where you're running at slow speeds. For other muscle strains, such as hamstring injuries, historically and based on biomechanics, we understand that that's not a risky situation for the hamstring, but it's actually a high load situation for the calf. And so we actually need really high calf capacity um, for these sorts of activities that, yeah, we haven't thought we sort of needed that in other injury management processes. So just the work demands, really, in summary, is potentially a big reason that the calf is so susceptible to recurrence.
So next question, may have should have probably come before the previous one. But in terms of risk factors themselves for initial calf injury, can you talk to us about that? Because I'm sure there's plenty for us to bounce off once we kind of go through this.
Yeah, yeah. So, look, believe it or not, there isn't a really significant amount of research into risk factors for calf strains compared to other muscle strain injuries. Um, we're actually doing a project at the moment, a national prevention project here in Australia, where we're trying to identify risk factors for index and recurrent calf strains. So, hopefully, more information in this space. From the work that's been completed to date, we can say that the strongest risk factors for a future calf strain are things like older age and having a previous history of a calf strain. Then we have other factors that show limited evidence for an association with a future calf injury, like having a previous history of a knee injury and having a previous history of another soft tissue injury affecting the lower limb. But the strength of evidence for those risk factors is much less compared to what we can say for being older and having a previous history of a calf strain. Now, often clinicians consider those risk factors as fairly obvious. Yeah, as you age, you lose
Don't
capacity,
get
and
old.
yeah,
Don't get
surprise,
old, and don't
surp-
get.
and don't get injured. You might get injured again.
Yeah. Yeah.
100%. But what I'd encourage everybody to do is just to consider what underpins those particular risk factors. So, what's actually occurring with older age? We know that we're getting a reduction in the physiological cross sectional area of the calf muscles, and we know that occurs in gastrocnemius and soleus. We know that we're getting a reduction in the muscle tendon unit stiffness throughout the calf MTU. There's evidence that you get things like a reduction in fascicle length. And so suddenly it's understandable that this boring risk factor of being older predisposes to a calf injury. And we can actually leverage or use that information to do targeted and individualized prevention. to induce structural adaptations to potentially offset the impact of older age as a risk factor for a subsequent calf strain injury by doing things like high load strengthening, high load isometrics to promote physiological cross sectional area, to promote MTU stiffness, and so forth.
Do you think that the calf, despite all the things that we've just said in terms of the data, what is it about the calf that sometimes means that those kind of relatively basic things that you've just said don't get ticked off for the calf?
Yeah,
What is it about it?
yeah.
Like
Look,
this, like strengthening, high load strengthening. Okay, we're going to do that for other areas of the lower limb, but why are we losing it for the calf? Why is it not valued?
that's a great question. I don't think it's necessarily always being undervalued. And certainly people can go at great lengths to develop calf capacity and a really high level of calf capacity. Um, but one of the tricky things with the calf is that because it has multiple roles biomechanically, in terms of force production, moderating and sort of tolerating stress, as well as its role even just in basic stabilization and posture and stability of the lower limb, um, considering the fact that not only does it need to produce large peak forces, but it needs to do that repeatedly, and it needs to have endurance with its force output. Further, considering that not only do we need things like good stiffness capacity instantaneously, but we need repeatability with that. And so, even across those four areas, I've just talked about four different properties that are really important for the calf to have. And so, we actually need breadth with our exercise selection for the calf that is potentially greater compared to other areas of the lower limb. And it could be that you're ticking off one of those areas and you're missing out on one. And so, the individual is susceptible to a calf injury. And so that leads me to some of the research that we're sort of doing and my interest in this space, in that I think that when we're trying to prevent calf injuries from occurring and also when we're planning our rehab processes, we actually need to profile across each of those key domains to highlight individual profiles, individual weaknesses. And then off the back end of that, we have our more specialized or targeted exercise selection to address the impairment that's most relevant to the person.
Just take us through them four again.
And there's probably more. I may have missed some.
Okay,
Okay, so if we start with strength or force
cool.
production,
Yep,
you've got your peak force, you've got your MVIC, your max force generating capacity.
yep.
Um,
So let's stay there for a second. In terms of screening that, I know that I don't want to like dumb this down to a simpleton level like myself, but I think going through this would be really interesting for people. So in terms of that first one, screening for potential risk and ideally prevention, what kind of screening are we doing for this particular
yeah.
domain?
So for max isometric strength or MVIC, it can be tested in seated position or standing position. And some research groups around the world have done really good work in this space. Alex Natera, of course. Seth O'Neill has done some really nice work in the rugby space. The Mattiusi paper, Adam Mattiusi, which I think was done in ballet.
Ballet, yeah.
Yeah, where both the seated and the standing position has been evaluated. Um, and so, a common seated type position would be seated with the hip at 90, the knee flexed, and then the ankle ideally in a degree of dorsiflexion, because we know that we're going to get things like our peak force generation and even better motor unit recruitment to soleus in a position of dorsiflexion. So I'd be screening or profiling in that sort of position for the seated setup to identify soleus strength in an isolated sort of capacity sense or an isolated capacity measure. The standing position, I think, is a really good position as well, and it's probably a reflection of our system strength. And we obviously know that we're going to get a really healthy or good contribution from both soleus and gastrocnemius in that standing position, as well as it's unavoidable that we'll get more proximal contributions because we're often in those standing positions, with the knee extended, the hip relatively extended, pushing up isometrically sort of into a bar. We are going to get a contribution from other muscles. So I'd probably put that standing type position as more of an overall system type indication of plantar flexion function and strength, whereas the seated position would obviously be that measure of isolated soleus capacity. And some decision making around whether you would choose one versus the other. Look, I think in an ideal world, and it's my professional bias, you'd test both. But if you had to pick one, say if you were working with an athlete that was rehabilitating or susceptible to soleus injuries, you might think about the seated type position. If it was potentially, a lower risk scenario, more aligned with performance, you could make an argument for going with the standing type position. So that's the MVIC measurement of our max force generating capacity, which is one of those nice strength qualities we know are important for calf function. And it underpins not only force generation, but things like muscle tendon unit stiffness, things like power output and RFD. So I think that's a really nice strength quality to profile and to measure. But there are others, obviously, too.
Of course. So strength done. What's the second one?
Yeah,
you mentioned?
so within strength, I still think there's value in testing strength through range. And doing things like single leg heel raise testing, which is going to give us an understanding of our body weight strength endurance capacity and the repeatability of our force production. Because there is data to suggest that you could be really strong in terms of your MVIC, but you actually don't have that endurance component to your calf capacity. Or it could be vice versa. You can do 50 repetitions to failure in the single leg heel raise test, but your MVIC is poor. And so what I'm talking about is we can have discrepancies within an individual's strength, and therefore we need to have breadth with our strength profiling and our strength exercise prescriptions. In terms of single leg heel raise testing, we just published a study that demonstrated the actual positional setup makes a big difference in the numbers that an athlete performs. We're doing things like being strict with the knee position, the ankle and foot alignment, ensuring that the trunk isn't rocking backwards and forwards, ensuring that the person isn't hiking their hip and that they're achieving max plantar flexion height each repetition, all the while doing the reps to a metronome rate of 60 beats per minute. That actually makes a big difference in how many repetitions they perform. And on average, they'll perform 12 fewer repetitions in that really standardized controlled setup that I'm talking about right now, compared to the version that we're all guilty of doing at times clinically and practically, where you say, okay, stand at the wall and show me how many calf raises you can do. So being really scientific and standardized does appear to matter. And I think it gives us a better understanding of that repeated force generating capacity, i.e. strength endurance within the calf muscle tendon unit. So they're two strength qualities that I think are important to focus on and to profile for.
I've got normative data that people can engage their athletes on, or is that sport specific? Is it what have we got in terms of numbers?
In terms of the repetitions to failure during the single leg heel raise, so we published data from sub-elite Australian football, testing waffle footballers here in Western Australia. So potentially you can compare that data if you're working within that sport or if you're working with running-based athletes as a bit of a benchmark. Kim Herbert-Lozier has done some outstanding work from New Zealand, mostly focusing on rugby athletes. Interestingly, within her standardized protocol, she found a similar number of repetitions to failure. So I believe in her most recent paper, it was 20 repetitions to failure, which is in the ballpark of what we're proposing based on our data. So really interpreting that information together, if you're working with a running based athlete, someone that needs repeatability with their force generation, it appears reasonable for you to expect at least 20, 22. Clinically, I often work with at least 25 or 30 because I want them to aim high, and perhaps have the greatest preventative effect if possible. But yeah, they're hopefully sort of benchmarks people can work from.
So on the max strength, the first one that you detailed,
Yeah.
is there any normative? Yeah, is there any normative data that you could share?
Yeah, so from Seth O'Neill and Matt Lee's really good work in the rugby space, I think they found their average within that cohort around 1.9 times body weight tested in the seated position. Over here in Australia, and I'm not jumping the gun, but we've tested over 770 legs across a range of sports. So Aussie rules football, um, basketball, baseball, among others. And we've found an average hovering between 1.5 and 1.6 times body weight in the seated position. And that could be a reflection of differences between sports. And that would probably fit, comparing rugby versus the sports that we've had available to us here in Australia. But they're potential benchmarks that people can work with in terms of seated max ISO strength. As mentioned, tested from a position of max dorsiflexion. And we both utilized the physiometer C station to carry out that test. And Seth published the protocol for that, and we'll publish that hopefully later this year. Based on Alex Natera's work in terms of a standing position, it looks like, and it seems logical, that people will be able to push much higher relative to body weight. So certainly if they're at the elite level, they might be expected to get over 3 times their body weight. And that makes sense based on the constraints of the test and so forth, and those factors that I mentioned earlier in the podcast.
Perfect. So done the first two different kinds of strength. What's number 3 that you mentioned?
Yeah, and I think then we're starting to think about dynamic function. We're thinking about the rate of force production. We're thinking about rate of force development, correlates of muscle tendon unit stiffness. And so I really like tests like the 10-5 to get an RSI as a proxy of some of those properties that I just mentioned as well. And Eamon Flanagan has done some nice work in this space and in terms of plyometric prescriptions as well. Clearly, with the 10-5, you'll get a bit of information about repeatability based on how it's calculated too. They published an interesting comparison as well between, reactive strength and reactive strength endurance. And if I remember correctly, within one of their studies, they actually got people to have a high degree of repeatability with a plyometric task and calculated their RSI at a much later time interval than what you would get in conventional plyometric type testing batteries. And if my memory serves me, I think it was after 55 seconds and between 55 and 60 seconds. If I've quoted it incorrectly, we can take it out. But the reason I raise that is that within their analysis, they did find that, to some extent, you could be good at a more standard 10-5 type test and not necessarily good at, or not necessarily have as high reactive strength endurance. And that, we're not always comparing apples with apples, and we might need to profile across those two sorts of capacity durations. But look, one of the weaknesses in what I'm proposing there, in terms of doing just some basic vertically oriented testing, is obviously that's all about pushing upwards and downwards. And the calf needs to help propel and push us forwards as well. And so where possible, I think, testing that horizontal component, horizontal force production and horizontal performance can add really strong value as well. And there was the nice paper that came out of the Aspetar group that showed the really high contribution at the ankle to forward hopping. And so, yeah, considering those reasons, I think if we're getting an instantaneous or a short duration, maximal or near maximal horizontal hop performance, as well as repeatability where relevant. So that might be asking someone to do it 5 times or for a distance, e.g., 10 meters or 15 meters. That could be a practical way to get an understanding as well of that horizontal capacity. And certainly you find when you dissect etiology of recurrence and people who have unfortunately had multiple repeat injuries, at face value, it could look like, they have really good strength, they have really good repeatability, they have really good plyometric function, but it's a subcomponent within these domains. And you need to go digging and you need to think about what the calf does, what the calf needs to do, and does it actually have breadth across the range of capacities it needs? Because as mentioned earlier in the podcast, the calf can burn you, unfortunately, if you don't have that breadth in capacities that it needs.
Was there a number 4 you mentioned?
I think I've said too many already.
Okay.
But if you'll let me keep raising a few,
Keep going. Yeah, please.
yeah. So if we've thought about strength, and within strength we have our MVIC and our repeated force production. Then within our plyometric or dynamic function, we have the vertical and horizontal component instantaneously, as well as with repeatability. It would be a logical step from there to start to even think about an individual's biomechanics. Okay. And Chris Bramer and his group in the UK have done some really nice work, trying to understand kinematic differences in individuals with a history of recurrent calf muscle strain injuries, and highlighted that there are things like increased contralateral pelvic drop during the stance phase of running, highlighting that in these in this sort of subset that do have repeat recurrences, it could also be that there are proximal impairments that predispose to calf injury if you're seeing things like, changes to more proximal mechanics. And so, interpreting that data clinically, I think there is value in watching people move, watching people run, seeing if there's anything obvious that highlights maybe they do have a discrepancy between what they can do in isolated, sort of less functional type positions or constraints, and what they're able to do more dynamically and moving and so forth. So I'd encourage people to do that. And then the other way I'd interpret that data clinically is I'd actually think about screening proximally. Okay, so do people actually have impairments at the thigh, so quad and hamstring, or at the hip and pelvis, particularly glute med and hip extension, that could impact your calf work demands, particularly during the stance phase of running and propulsion during jumping, make the calf overwork and lead to sort of calf overload related injuries, because that's a possibility that you see as well. And certainly there is that profile that many people have probably faced, where you test the calf and the calf can actually test quite well, but then when you look elsewhere, there are impairments that you need to address.
You'll meet Chris in Manchester, by the way, because he's on the speaker lineup, and he came on the podcast, and he's an absolute legend.
Oh,
So we'll,
outstanding.
I'm sure you'll have some. Have you met Chris before? Spoken to him?
No, not previously. So
Okay,
look,
okay.
I'll really look forward to
You'll
that.
enjoy it. You'll enjoy
and
it.
and Chris, hopefully I haven't made a meal of your good work in this space.
No, absolutely not. No, he's an absolute legend. So you'll enjoy meeting him. So let's move on to the rehab side. And we spoke before around the kind of common questions that you get in this particular area. And structuring calf rehab was probably one that encompassed a lot of the things that you said. So what are your thoughts? What are your recommendations to people in terms of the structure of a calf rehab, and what factors come into play?
Yeah, great question. So, look, taking a really broad perspective initially, if we separate our rehab approach into phases, clearly we have our sort of very early phase where we're managing the fresh calf injury. Then we have a phase of early loading, where we're starting to test the waters with loading the calf and re-exposing it to a little bit of work, and building strength. And then after that, a more intermediate type rehab phase where things like strength loads are rising, and we might also be reintroducing running within this intermediate phase. And then after that, we'd really have an advanced return to training and eventually return to play phase. And if I can, I'd then also sneak in a post return to play phase, because there is some data to suggest that people are at risk of recurrent calf strain for a long time after they do return to play, and certainly longer than other muscle strains, up to 4 months. And so I think that our exercise prescription, our high quality loading, and our load management needs to continue after return to play. So I'd actually keep that as a sort of a bit tacked on to the end. But each of those phases are what you would plan for and map around for any moderate to severe calf injury. Certainly, there's a subset of calf injuries that are mild in nature, okay, and they can actually turn around quite quickly at times. And there's examples where people can actually, return to play within a week or so, a week or two, after a mild calf strain. And there are cases where, and I've had these clinically, where people can actually play with pathology, and get by with it. So in those examples, there's not really scope to go through all of these staged steps that I just mentioned, because they recover quite soon. So really the stages and the structured steps are more biased towards an injury that you're working with. As soon as you identify that, this could be more of a moderate to severe type calf strain, and they're following more of a conventional rehab process. And so perhaps should we talk about what happens within each of those rehab phases, Rob? Yep.
Absolutely. And I think this may not come up in in this little bit, so I'll just ask this question. So those that can play with pathologies, is there anything that we can do apart from just general load management? Is there anything that you would recommend to keep that going without it pushing on to then becoming a moderate or severe injury?
Uh, at times being lucky.
Okay.
No, no, I jest, I joke. Um, Look, within those scenarios, clearly knowing the athlete and knowing the person really well is a key factor. Knowing that they're a coper, that they have a really good training history behind them, and training chronicity. Surprise, surprise, these are often the people that, have had uninterrupted exposure for a long period of time. They've got really good tissue adaptation supporting the pathology in the lesion. Despite it, they've got really good strength and good function in the calf, both under strength sort of conditions as well as under dynamic conditions. They tend to have really good strength throughout the whole kinetic chain, throughout the whole lower limb, and be good movers. So I'd certainly be assessing each of those areas to be really confident that they were in the basket that, they might be able to get by. And then I would be prescribing exercises and matching my load to, encourage capacity in each of these areas that will then, hopefully put them in a really good spot not to fail and develop the pathology more significantly. And that's sort of all physio related, or physio related perspectives. Then there's the load management perspective, which physio has some say in, but also, our conditioning colleagues, often, they're sort of charged with that side of things. I'd just be considering the volume of exposure, and not necessarily prioritizing overall volume. If you know that you're trying your luck to get by, you might just focus on quality, and then really emphasize recovery and upregulate that outside of your loading times. Thinking about things like frequency of loading too, and maybe avoiding back-to-back days where you can, in terms of days on legs and running and field-based training, just to upregulate that recovery component. They could be some sort of practical things to think about.
Love it. Right, let's go back 2 minutes and let's take us
Yeah.
through take us through these phases.
Okay, so look, really early on when you have this fresh calf injury, there's clearly a phase where you're doing things to ensure that you don't worsen the pathology. But there's nothing wrong early with testing the waters with some really basic loading to see what the calf can and can't handle. And that could be doing simple things like isometric loading with TheraBand or even in a seated position against the weight of a light dumbbell or a kettlebell, and testing the waters with things like weight bearing plantar flexion, i.e., calf raises at the wall. And probably in this sense, your exercise selection is part of your assessment and your understanding regarding prognosis, where even irrespective of the pathology that you might see on MRI, if you're finding that someone early days, they can actually load the calf with single leg heel raises, and they can even do some basic isometric recruitment against a kettlebell in a seated position, um, they could be in a pretty good spot, and they could have a faster prognosis or a better return to play prognosis compared to if you just based your progressions on what you saw on MRI. But nonetheless, early days, I'd be looking at those sort of basic forms of loading to get an understanding of their capacity, but also to expose their tissue to load, which we know will stimulate recovery and stimulate healing, versus if we just completely detrain. There are some really severe calf injuries where you might not be able to do that. That's a caveat. But where you can, you'd sort of be trialing that early loading. This early phase is also a great opportunity to focus on those dynamic synergists. And that synergistic function is obviously proximal. So in your thigh and your hip and pelvic muscles, to ensure that you have a really, really good level of function within those muscles that are going to help the calf out when you're producing and moderating really large forces during the stance phase of running, and also at the foot. So, are there any impairments in terms of strength or a lack of motor control with intrinsic foot function? And if you've identified that within your clinical assessment, while the calf loading isn't high and you're not doing a large volume of it just yet, you could have really high value in focusing on these synergists and getting their function to a really high level. So I'd be doing that as early as you can. And it certainly gives the athlete or the patient something strong to focus on from the outset when their calf may just be, yeah, doing much less than what they're used to. And then over time, you're progressively exposing the calf to greater strength loads. And I think it's a good idea to be prioritizing both isometric strength as well as isotonic or strength through range. You know, and that fits in strongly with what we talked about regarding profiling and max ISO strength in addition to strength through range and the potential roles that they play that they do have differences. So I'd be doing, isometric strengthening in addition to strengthening through range. Through range strengthening can be done, utilizing the Smith machine, either in standing or seated position. You can also utilize that for your ISO strength stuff, as well as some more functional positioning at the wall, doing things like ISO switches. Um, and when you're getting confident that their strength is rising, you'd begin to expose to more locomotive type activities and plyometrics and elementary stretch shortening cycle activities. Um, but clearly, you would test before you do things like hopping prescriptions and skipping prescriptions. But when you can, you need to develop that more dynamic capacity of the calf, both vertically and horizontally. And tying in with profiling and testing, not only over time would you develop that all out instantaneous capacity, e.g., how high, how far forwards, how far laterally a person can propel and jump, but you'd also train and measure the repeatability. So their ability to do that at more submaximal intensities over time. And those two areas tie in strongly with people's running demands generally, in that for the calf, you need this high end capacity, but you also need the ability to do it over time. And so the plyometric prescriptions fit in with that. And then after that, you're hopefully aiming for a clearance to return to run. In and around running, you can be doing some really nice supportive locomotive conditioning like prowler work and sled pulls. Um, and, based on some of the data more in the performance space, you can manipulate how you focus on things like prowler and sleds in terms of if there's more of a force component or more of a velocity type component, and link that in with the athlete and their sport demands. So are you doing things that are much heavier and you're prioritizing force production, or is the weight, the intensity somewhat lower or more moderate, and you're actually moving the prowler or the sled much, much quicker? And they are key clinical considerations. And for the calf, where you can, particularly if it's a longer rehab and you have time, I'd have breadth and I'd cover off on both bases to be really sure that they have that good capacity. And then hopefully, after you've ticked off all of these things, so you've done some nice early loading, you've progressed your strength loads to get their strength qualities really, really high, and you should be aiming high for the benchmarks that we talked about earlier. You've progressed some low level plyometrics and stretch shortening cycle activities, focusing on vertical, horizontal, and lateral into really demanding plyos. You've done some locomotive reconditioning and you've built out a running profile based on the sport. Hopefully, that's a pretty foolproof process for you to A, perform at return to play, and B, avoid a recurrent injury.
In that final transition to return to competition, return to training, is there anything that you would do there to give clearance in terms of testing, or just would it be a replication of what we just talked about?
Yeah, so, we're essentially talking about return to play criteria, aren't we?
Yep. Yep.
Um, and so some of the criteria that we're about to talk about, it's possible that you've checked that off earlier in the rehab process, such as some of your strength markers. And I certainly wouldn't save them all to the week before return to play and try and test them all just before, for obvious reasons. But what I wanted to mention was, even if you've checked them off earlier in the process, you still monitor and ensure their maintenance and that they haven't dropped off prior to return to play, which can sometimes happen because around the time of return to play, there's a fatigue associated with training more, running more, and that's unavoidable. And it could be that while someone's had their MVIC and their reps to failure with a single leg heel raise checked off early in rehab, when they actually do more running, they're exposed to greater workloads later in rehab. There could be fatigue associated with that makes their strength drop off. And certainly, if someone's strength did drop off just before return to play, that'd be something you would want to know about, because it could, predispose them to a recurrent injury. But I digress. In terms of return to play clearance, you're checking off those strength qualities. So your MVIC or your max isometric strength, your body weight strength endurance. In terms of loaded strength endurance, isotonically, so doing things like single leg calf raises in a Smith machine. Um, I don't have a strict number for you, but you'd want to ensure that their strength is at a good level and that they're showing things like really good movement coordination and control, particularly getting into their inner range plantar flexion or their terminal plantar flexion, and that they can moderate the stress and control the eccentric phase, and that they're not just dropping. So that's your loaded strength endurance, which you'd more observe in the gym versus test sort of in an isolated situation. You'd want to do, hop testing, jump testing, vertically, horizontally, and then you'd also want to have a look at their workload, and is the running workload that they've completed in rehab reasonable based on what they're going to try and do in their return match and subsequent weeks, or do they actually not have enough running and training behind them, and that you need to actually give them a bit longer of a lead in? Um, so there's some key factors that I'd check off in terms of return to play clearance, and then we have some non-quantifiables. So, you know, even your conversations with the person and the athlete in terms of how they're coping with the loading, how they're coping with the training. Um, do you get a sense that they have, a large DOMS response to main training before they're returning to play? And are they slow to recover? So those are things that aren't always necessarily picked up on testing in terms of objective data, but they're things that you would get from chatting with the person, and even doing just your basic clinical testing, such as their range of motion pre versus post training in terms of bent knee and straight knee stretch. Um, so I wouldn't discount the value of those non-quantifiable factors in return to play clearance too.
I'll be honest with you, Brady. I was super excited for the rehab conference and to get you over. I'm even more excited now because this, yeah, very comprehensive. Love it. Absolutely love
Uh-huh.
it. So we spoke about an international calf project, which sounds very grand. Would you just talk us through what that entails and what's going to come off the back of it, potentially maybe who's involved, and then I'll let you go because I've kept you long enough.
Oh no, I appreciate that. So, look, I'm really fortunate to be working with some great clinicians and researchers in the calf space. Tanya Pizzari, Miles Murphy, Rod and Evan at Aspetar, of course. Um, Seth O'Neill in the UK, as well as some others, where we're really trying to work together to understand and prevent calf injuries. And so, off the back of that, we've developed an international calf project where we're working with some peak international and national sporting bodies to collate information about calf injuries, how they behave post injury, as a mechanism to understand, rehab trajectory, useful milestones, when things should be occurring post injury, what could be a flag that things are, potentially going more slowly or could be leading towards a recurrence, as well as a bit of epidemiological understanding as well. So we're sort of trying to answer, many questions about the calf through this international calf project that we're really, really excited about, and we were successful in securing some grant funding. And it's off the back of historically Evan at Aspetar, his first iteration of the calf project, um, which was very, very successful and very popular. And over time, we'll build out even more involvement and support from other teams.
Sounds exciting. Sounds really good. But no, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And the depth and detail you've given has been superb. But if anyone wants to dive into some of your work in this area and others, where's the best place? Is social media guy, not a social media guy?
Oh, I fluctuate probably, to be fair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nah, look, happy for you to touch base via Twitter or X. Absolutely. That's probably the best starting point, I think.
And research wise, ResearchGate?
Yeah, ResearchGate is somewhat up to date. If there's any research that we've spoken about and you're interested in, yeah, please reach out and I'll try and get journal articles to you and so forth.
Lovely. Well, Brady, thank you very much again. I really appreciate it. Stick around, we'll have a little chat, but look forward to meeting in person in October for the Rehab conference. And thank you again.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, mate.